Well, this is All Out Politics, news, debate and opinion from the heart of Westminster. Well, three candidates to be the next Labour leader clashed over the party's response to anti-Semitism in last night's Sky News debate. As Kier Starmer told Lisa Nandy she was speaking nonsense when she said her fellow Shadow Cabinet member Rebecca Long-Bailey had failed to speak out about the issue. Well, in a moment we'll discuss who came out on top. First, here's our Deputy Political Editor Sam Coates looking back at last night's big moments.
Make your mind up time for Labour. By Monday, a poll suggests over half the party will have cast their vote to determine the next leader of the opposition. Last night, Sky News showed just what was at stake.
And this is the Labour debate.
With a clear front runner in this contest, a game changer is needed to shake things up. So some of the attacks, like this one on Brexit, were pretty direct.
You've got the Shadow Brexit Secretary standing next to you. Is he to blame?
Well, it was a disaster. It was an absolute disaster. And I think there is a collective failure of leadership on Brexit that we have to own up to as a party.
Whose fault is Labour's Brexit confusion? Well, Kier Starmer said we should be asking a different question.
Now Johnson is heading for no deal or nearly no deal. If we become leader of the Labour Party, will we take him on or we will give in to him? And that's the question we need to answer.
When it comes to the post-mortem on Labour's election manifesto, two candidates had pretty clear views.
You wouldn't drop anything from the manifesto.
No, I think they were the right answers to the right questions. So the Green Industrial Revolution is a key policy. It was a huge policy.
But the electorate didn't agree.
Well, I think they did. It was a very popular policy.
Let me support Becky on some of the policies in the manifesto, because I didn't get any sense that they were unpopular. I just think by the time we got to the point that the election had been called, people had stopped listening.
But the frontrunner again had a more broad brush answer.
In that election, I met many people who said that this isn't right. It's got to change. But they didn't trust us to do it.
Trying to maintain trust and trying not to put a foot wrong on the subject of anti-Semitism is hard when you're way out in front.
And I would just say this to Kier, is that I believe that you are sincere about this, but if we do not acknowledge how badly the Shadow Cabinet as a whole got this wrong, we will not earn the trust of the Jewish community, and those people that you talk about, who I want to see back in the party, will never look to us again.
Lisa, you were in a Shadow Cabinet when this issue came up as well.
And I spoke out.
Can the person in pole position go on the attack?
Do you remember Rebecca Long-Bailey speaking out in Shadow Cabinet?
I think, given where we've got to, I think the last thing our members, our movement and our country wants is us all trying to take lumps out of each other.
But the plea didn't work as Kier Starmer faced suggestions he should be excluded on grounds of gender.
I don't want Boris Johnson crowing on the other side of the dispatch box if we don't get a female leader this time.
If I succeed in this, will you work with me to unite our party so that we can fight as a collective force going forward to the next general election together?
Yes.
Absolutely.
The favourite undeterred, but the audience wanting a different outcome.
Lisa Nandy?
Sam Coates, Sky News.
Rebecca Long-Bailey?
Well, of course, an unrepresentative straw poll there at the end. So who really came out better? Joining me now, the former Labour Deputy Leader in the European Parliament, Seb Dance, and the Chief Labour Writer for The Observer, Sonia Sodha. Welcome to you both. I mean, let's just take an overview of the debate. They had a lot of hustings between them. This was a high-profile debate. I mean, how do you see this whole leadership contest shaping up now?
Well, it's interesting. We had that Sky poll come out the day before the hustings, which puts, Kier Starmer, it's a poll of members, supporters, the first one in a month. It put him very clearly out in front. And I think you saw the sort of dynamics of that in the debate yesterday, actually. You saw it being reflected in the way that the candidates interacted with each other. Kier Starmer, he clearly is the front runner. It's kind of considered to be his to lose now, which is an extraordinary thing when you think that, 12 weeks ago, people just thought that the left of the party had this thing all sewn up. But because he's the front runner, I think he's playing it quite safe. He wants to, he talks about the need for unity, but he's also saying a lot of stuff that means all things to all people. So that's his strategy. Whereas you saw Lisa Nandy and Rebecca Long-Bailey, I think, and particularly Lisa Nandy being the underdog of the contest. She was third place in that poll, really trying to kind of score some hits on Kier Starmer.
OK, just break away a moment from the Labour Party. The Chief Medical Officer in Wales, this is some breaking news, has confirmed the first case of coronavirus in Wales. But returning to the Labour issue, I mean, for Labour voters, the big question is, did any of those three look like the people who can beat Boris Johnson at the next election?
Yes, well, I certainly think, in my own personal opinion, that two of them did. And I think that when you look back at the election, Lisa and Kier, I think that the two of them have demonstrated that they have what it takes. I think Kier came out on top. That's my personal view. I think Lisa has gone out very strongly in terms of being direct, but I think she's wrong in her analysis on a lot of what she says. And I think Kier is the person who really understands the scale of the challenge, but also what we need to appeal to those voters. But I will say, in the election, Kier's name came up time and time again on the doorstep as someone that people would trust.
I mean, his style was quite interesting, wasn't it? Because he was trying to be, like the senior member, if you like, sort of saying, well, even defending Rebecca Long Bailey on anti-Semitism and saying, I want to work with both of you. So he's now almost moved into the next phase of preparing to win.
Yeah, well, I mean, at the end, you saw there all candidates recognising that the core fact about winning elections, which is that you need a united party. You cannot win when you're divided. Yes, of course, this is a leadership contest, so you're going to have divisions out in the open, but there is actually a forensic analysis going on of what went wrong in the general election that we've just had. The Tories, on the other hand, are not having a sort of debate about what's happening. They've got their person and they'll follow him come what may. So I think, out of this process, we should have a party that is united. We should have a party that has a clearer sense of what its objectives are. And I think Kier is right to take the view that actually, in order to go forward, we need to bring together all of the wings of the party, all of the sections of the party that hitherto have been fighting each other. The only way we're going to win the next general election and defeat Boris with his 80 majority that he's got at the moment is by being united.
I mean, let's look at some of those issues. I mean, as you say, to a certain extent, the election, the Conservative Party have buried the issue of Brexit for the Conservatives, that they're all singing from the same hymn sheet. But what about the Labour Party? Because, again, last night we could see that there were still quite a lot of niggling over the issue of Brexit.
Well, I think, on Brexit, nothing has really happened other than people like me have lost their jobs, and that's very sad for me. But ultimately, we're still in the European ecosystem. We still have free movement, etc., etc. Businesses are still free to trade.
Let's just listen to that exchange on Brexit.
So who's to blame then for that Brexit? I mean, you've got the shadow Brexit secretary standing next to you. Is he to blame?
Well, it was a disaster.
I take responsibility for everything in our manifesto. It was actually a shadow cabinet decision. It was actually a decision of our whole party at party conference. But I'm not going to shirk from that.
What do you make about the Brexit? What role is it playing in this leadership contest?
Well, you've got in this contest people who sort of fall on opposite sides of the divide. So Keir Starmer was a very prominent Remainer, shadow Brexit secretary, really pushed the second referendum policy, which happens to be a policy that I completely agreed with. Lisa Nandy represents a Leave seat. She was pushing much more for a kind of like, we need to accept the result of the referendum and talk about what an acceptable Labour deal would look like. So it's not a surprise that it's playing out like this in the leadership contest. I think the advantage is, though, is that with Brexit done, and none of these candidates are saying we need to start campaigning to rejoin the EU, it does take the heat out of it a little bit. I still think there are kind of issues that the new leader will have to sort of flesh out. What is Labour's Brexit policy going forward? Is it for a soft Brexit, single market customs union membership, which means free movement? Is it not that? Is it something else? But that will sort of come in due course. But I think the heat has gone out of the debate a bit. It's not a surprise it is a feature of this leadership contest, but Brexit is done now.
Well, it's not, but that's the core number of it, really, because you've had the UK's negotiating position, which was released yesterday, completely at odds, of course, with the Commission's. It's hard to see how there is any common ground there at all. Now, that, of course, will have implications for British business, going forward. That's where we hold the government.
But within Labour, it's very clear that there is this division now, which, basically between the majority of Labour voters who are Remainers, and the red wall seats that Lisa Nandy was talking about, who are leavers.
Of course,
it is going to be a big issue for the party.
But I mean, we lost more votes to from Remainers than we did from Leavers, and if you look at the ratio where our votes came from, we would have done even worse had we gone in a position that hadn't advocated.
You don't want to carry on going down that road.
No, of course, absolutely not. No, and you can't look back and think what could have been or what should have been. You have to look forward. But looking forward, it is inevitable that the government is going to run into problems with our economy. Of course, with the coronavirus issues coming up, there are convenient other ways of explaining an economic downturn. Inevitably, that's where the government's focus will come. But we need an opposition to hold them to account, and that's what we've not had until recently. So the context will change. And I think that could have a really interesting dynamic when it comes to the Brexit discussion, because there are clear, real issues that have to be overcome that we're not talking about at the moment, because there is this perception that Brexit is done, when of course it isn't.
We saw point scoring on the whole question of anti-Semitism. I have to say the takeaway I get from this, that all of them know to a certain extent they were complicit in what went on under Jeremy Corbyn, but all of them will genuinely try a lot harder
Yeah, and I think particularly from Kier and Lisa, we've seen important commitments on what they would do around this. But I think the language is also important. And, I wouldn't even necessarily characterise it as point scoring, because I do think Lisa Nandy did speak out about this repeatedly. And she obviously, being outside of the shadow cabinet, had more freedom to do so than someone like Kier Starmer. So that was sort of the point that she was making last night. And I think she's right, actually. She said very clearly and strongly, the shadow cabinet got this wrong. It kind of doesn't matter what you're saying behind closed doors. The external world doesn't get to see that. What they got to see was a party that was in denial about a problem with anti-Semitism, and Jeremy Corbyn never got to grips with it. And I think if you were in Jeremy Corbyn's shadow cabinet of the last 2 or 3 years, you do have to kind of hold your hands up and say, yeah, we got it wrong.
OK, now, they refused to say who they would give their second preference votes to. But if we assume that Sir Keir Starmer is the clear front runner, just interested in who you think is going to come second in this contest. Is it going to be Lisa Nandy? Is it going to be Rebecca Long-Bailey?
Well, I would think I'm basing this purely on the poll that came out the other day. I think it was a sample size of 1,200, something like that. So I would assume that Rebecca would come second if Kier came first. But no one can be complacent, because as we've seen in recent years, polls are one thing and what actually happens is quite another.
It seems that Rebecca Long-Bailey is struggling a bit and Lisa Nandy's coming up a bit. But
it does, and you've got to look at sort of that momentum as well as exactly like bang on where they are. But, it's much harder to poll Labour members and supporters accurately than it is the general public. So things could change. People have only just started voting. I think people will maybe watch the last couple of weeks of hustings some members and take a decision accordingly. So, yeah, it looks like it's Keir Starmer's to lose, but you never know.
OK, we'll leave it there. Thank you all very much indeed. This is All Out Politics. Coming up next, the journalist Toby Young on his defence of free speech.